want to speak to you about something that's really very close to my heart, and that is the difference between a terrorist and a freedom fighter. Now, I will first read you the definitions of the two terms. And a terrorist is a person who uses unlawful violence and intimidation, especially against civilians in the pursuit of political aims. Then if I go to the definition of a freedom fighter is a person engaged in a resistance movement against what they believe to be an oppressive and illegitimate government. Now, if we look at the history of the country, it is steeped in many forms of terrorism. We've had many different terrorist organizations plaguing our country in the past, and many parts of the world has been plagued by terrorists. We also know that all over the world, most of the time, that there are freedom fighters trying to fight against what they believe is wrong within a specific government or regime or dictatorship. Now, if we look at the history of South Africa, we have been terrorized by many organizations. Now, the difference to me with a terrorist and actually accepting the concept of terrorism is that anyone that says that being a terrorist or doing or performing terrorist acts or assisting terrorist acts is okay, is when a terrorist organization actually takes over the government of a country, where they then call those terrorists freedom fighters, which is not the case. A terrorist is a terrorist. When you intimidate people to vote for you, when you intimidate people through necklacing, when you intimidate people through all sorts of forms of violence and suppression, and suppresses freedom fighters that are really wanting to create change legitimately within a government or within a system, then you are a terrorist and will remain a terrorist. A freedom fighter is someone that believes that there's something that oppresses them or something that their government is doing that is illegitimate. Laws maybe that they've passed that are illegitimate. And at the moment in South Africa, we probably have the greatest amount of freedom fighters assembled ever in the history of this country, as people from across the political spectrum is fighting what our government is doing right now during the COVID-19 lockdown. Now, I don't want to speculate over whether the lockdown is justified or not. That is not what I'm about. I believe there is a real virus and that the real virus kills people. That does not mean that the actions that have been taken by our government is okay under a democracy. Now, I do not believe that the South African government, even during the apartheid years, that democracy existed. Not even now. We have a constitution which says that there is a Bill of Rights that should protect us, but this constitution is fraught with errors, and that is why there is a constitutional court. Many of the laws of our country is unconstitutional still to this day. Many of the regulations and what people call laws that have been passed under the Disaster Management Act are actually illegal and unconstitutional. And if you go and try those in the Constitutional Court, they will not be able to withstand our current constitution. We have one big problem, and that is that we're sitting with a government that act like a gang. In other words, all the political parties that sit in government currently act like a gang system where they protect each other. Now, in a gang system, it's very easy for terrorism to take place. If we look at the Cape Flats, for instance, it is fraught with terrorist activities, and people don't call it that anymore. They are so used to this terrorism in society, which is people actually threatening your normal civil activities. Intimidation, violence is all part of terrorism, especially if it's against civilians. Now, this is happening in our country continuously. So terrorism has continued. When our current government go to people and say to them, if you don't vote for us, we are going to negatively affect your community or not assist your community or not help your community, and if these actions happen behind the scenes, That is called terrorism. And I have plenty evidence of that I will cover in future videos. But you can rest assured that our current government that they are acting like terrorists currently. If you look at the current lockdown regulations, if the mainstream people in the country do not agree with it, then you are being oppressed. You are being intimidated. We are being intimidated. The public is being intimidated, and who is being used to intimidate us? The police and the military. Which means that the moment you elect terrorists into government, they will carry on terrorizing the people. Nothing has changed. Many of the leaders in government currently have received training in the former Soviet Union to become communist agents and communist terrorists. They were actually trained in terrorism within the Kremlin, and our president is no exception. So I want to ask every citizen out there in South Africa currently to become freedom fighters. If you are not a freedom fighter already, start fighting for freedom. Remember that these laws or these regulations that have been passed under the Disaster Management Act, because we are not in a state of emergency, they are not laws that can be upheld in a court of law. We still fall under the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And when any of your rights are taken away, you can challenge that in the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court has to uphold those values, because they are not epidemiologists. Those judges that sit there have to look at the Constitution and see whether the Constitution has been applied. If you look at other countries in the world, you will see that they were more democratic about their decisions. For instance, in the US, President Donald Trump, and I'm not defending him by any means, but what he did do is present immediately a panel of physicians to speak to the public, to convince them that what actions they are asking them to take are constitutional. When the people started protesting, they weren't shot at with rubber bullets or tear gas or anything. They were allowed to protest because under the American Constitution, they are still allowed to do those things. If we try that in South Africa, what do you think will happen? Well, the only way to find out is for a protest to actually be held, to see what the military, of which the entire military force has been deployed, and the police, what will they actually do on the ground? And based on the evidence, considering that 8 people have been killed that I know of within South Africa due to the lockdown regulations, I don't think that the citizens of this country is actually at the forefront of any terrorist consideration, because terrorists don't work for the people. Terrorists care only for one thing, and that is power. Maintaining that power at all cost. And this is what our current government is doing.